A day of high political drama in the U.S. We have special coverage for you on the release of the long-anticipated Mueller report. Hello to you. I'm Suhanna Marchand. That report is going to be in the hands of the U.S. lawmakers this hour. We will bring you the details of it as soon as they are made public. What will it reveal? How will the Trump White House respond? This is CBC News Network on the story.
Investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election.
The U.S. Attorney General defends Donald Trump before the release of that Mueller report. He says the investigation did not or did look closely at several episodes of possible obstruction of justice. And here's the scene right now unfolding in Washington. This is at the White House. We are waiting for comments from Donald Trump this hour. This is an event with wounded warriors, and perhaps he will make some comments on the Mueller report. I can tell you earlier, Trump slammed the investigation on Twitter, calling it, quote, presidential harassment. Now, the president will be speaking at this event to honor veterans. We'll watch, we'll wait for his comments, and we'll carry them for you right here on CBC News Network. So this 11 o'clock Eastern time, this is really the hour in Washington. The redacted version of that Mueller report, it's on its way to Capitol Hill, should get into the hands of those legislators very soon. It's a crucial moment in Donald Trump's presidency. Many say a crucial moment for American democracy. We don't know what that report says yet, but the U.S. Attorney General repeated his interpretation this morning, and he said no collusion with Russia, no criminal effort to obstruct justice.
Thanks to the special counsel's thorough investigation, we now know that the Russian operatives who perpetrated these schemes did not have the cooperation of President Trump or the Trump campaign, or the knowing assistance of any other American for that matter. The Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Although the Deputy Attorney General and I disagreed with some of the special counsel's legal theories and felt that some of the episodes examined did not amount to obstruction as a matter of law, we did not rely solely on that in making our decision.
It's now almost 2 years since Robert Mueller was appointed special counsel to do just that, investigate Russia's election interference, whether Trump's campaign team conspired with the Russians, and whether the president attempted to quash any investigations. That decision by Barr to publicly state there was no effort to obstruct justice, it has been criticized by Democrats. Barr was asked by reporters this morning why he felt it was up to him to determine there was no crime when Mueller really had left that open.
The very prosecutorial function and all our powers as prosecutors, including the power to convene grand juries and the compulsory process that's involved there, is for one purpose and one purpose only. It's determine yes or no. Was alleged conduct criminal or not criminal? That is our responsibility, and that's why we have the tools we have. And we don't go through this process just to collect information and throw it out to the public. We collect this information, we use that compulsory process for the purpose of making that decision. And because the special counsel did not make that decision, we felt the department had to, and that was a decision by me and the Deputy Attorney General. Yes.
Or did the special counsel indicate that he wanted you to make the decision, or that it should be left for Congress? And also, how do you respond to criticism you're receiving from congressional Democrats that you're acting more as an attorney for the president rather than as the chief law enforcement officer?
Well, Special Counsel Mueller did not indicate that his purpose was to leave the decision to Congress. I hope that was not his view, since we don't convene grand juries and conduct criminal investigations for that purpose. He did not, I didn't talk to him directly about the fact that we were making the decision, but I am told that his reaction to that was that it was my prerogative as Attorney General to make that decision.
There's a lot of public interest in the absence of the special counsel and members of his team. Was he invited to join you up on the podium? Why is he not here? This is his report, obviously, that you're talking about today.
No, it's not. It's a report he did for me as the Attorney General. He is required under the regulation to provide me with a confidential report. I'm here to discuss my response to that report and my decision, entirely discretionary, to make it public, since these reports are not supposed to be made public.
Breaking news on this Mueller report. The redacted version has been delivered to Congress. It will be made public, so it is online. And we are all working on getting information and digestible portions of this 400-page report to you. Lots of questions. How much is redacted? What are those 10 incidents that could have led to possible obstruction by the president that Mueller had investigated? Barr, of course, said that he decided there was no evidence enough to charge the U.S. president with obstruction. There are 4 areas that will be redacted, and that will give us also a sense of how much, what percentage of this report actually did not make it out to the public. We've got CBC's Ellen Morrow standing by in our Washington bureau. Also for you, Julia Manchester from The Hill is in Washington. Great to have both of you on the program. Let me pick your brain. I know you want to get to that report. Ellen, when you do, what's the first section you're going to get to?
Well, so Hannah, I have it open now. I'm scrolling through it. Again, this is a nearly 400-page document, so it's going to be a lot of work to go through it. But there obviously are redacted sections, but there are a lot of sections that aren't redacted. And I think a lot of people are going to be speeding to the obstruction of justice section of the report. Because as you said, Robert Mueller did not make a determination himself on whether or not the president committed a crime. He simply said, we have not concluded the president committed a crime, but we have not exonerated him either. That left it up to William Barr, the Attorney General, to make that decision. So people are going to be speeding to that section of the report as it's out right now, trying to look at Robert Mueller's reasoning for why he didn't make that determination, and trying to figure out in the report what those 10 incidents were that Robert Mueller investigated. William Barr, in his letter last month, said a lot of these instances were in the public realm or had been reported publicly, but we need to find out what all 10 of those instances were. It's also important to point out that we heard from William Barr talk about just how cooperative President Trump was in the overall investigation when he was saying that despite being frustrated with it, he was cooperative. President Trump did not sit for an interview with the special counsel, nor did he answer questions on this obstruction of justice front. So I'm just going to go to the index of the report and get there, but that's where legal analysts are going to be heading right away.
All right, Ellen, I'm going to ask you to put your patience hat on for me, and Julia Manchester as well for you, because we're going to take our viewers live just for a little break right now to the White House. U.S. President Donald Trump is there. He is hosting an event for a Wounded Warriors Project, saying he's very thrilled to do so. Let's listen for comments on this Mueller report, if there are any. Let's listen in for a bit live here on CBC News Network.
We're also grateful to be joined by Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan. Patrick, thank you very much. Great job you're doing. "100% of the caliphate." So that was great. That was one of our early assignments, right, with you. So I appreciate it. Great job, Pat. General Counsel of Veteran Affairs, Jim Byrne. Jim, thank you very much, Jim. Great job. And Army Vice Chief of Staff General James McConville. James, thank you, James. Thank you very much. I also want to thank 2 great congressmen for being here, and if we had room, we would have had a lot more. Phil Rowe and James Baird. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kelly. And they're having a good day. I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction. There never was, by the way, and there never will be. And we do have to get to the bottom of these things, I will say. And this should never happen I say this in front of my friends, wounded warriors, and I just call them warriors because we just shook hands and they look great. They look so good, so beautiful. But I say it in front of my friends, this should never happen to another president again. This hoax, this should never happen to another president again. Thank you. With us on stage today are the wounded warriors from the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, the National Guard, and the Marine Corps. Each of you is a living
U.S.
testament
President Donald Trump,
to the
he is speaking at an event in the White House for wounded warriors, saying he's thrilled to host it. But we were listening in particular for comments about the Robert Mueller report, which has now been released in a redacted version. And you heard Donald Trump there say, no obstruction. He says there never was and there never will be, and went on to say that this should never happen to another president. That is referring to the fact that the Mueller report did not come out with any prosecutorial suggestions against the president when it comes to obstruction of justice. We've got a couple of people whose brains I want to pick right now. So CBC's Ellen Morrow is in our Washington bureau. She's standing by. We've also got Julia Manchester from the Hill. She's in Washington. Ellen, you told me you wanted to go to that section on obstruction of justice. Let me hear from you, Julia. What's the most interesting thing for you as you try to parse through these 400 pages of redacted information? What is really turning your crank?
Well, I think right now I'm a little annoyed because the report is taking forever to download, and I think a lot of reporters feel that way as well right now. However, in addition to the obstruction question, I would really like to look at questions surrounding Jared Kushner and Donald Trump Jr. It's interesting because Barr, before this report was released, said that there would be information redacted that could potentially harm or be damaging to a private citizen. And it's interesting. I don't think that this as much applies to Jared Kushner. However, Donald Trump Jr. could very much fall into that category. And obviously, Donald Trump Jr. has been a very central part of this entire probe. Remember, a lot of our interest in him were spiked when he took that meeting with the Russian lawyer, Natalia Veselnitskaya, in June of 2016, I believe, at Trump Tower. And that's what really perked everyone's ears up to whether there was collusion or some sort of coordination in the campaign. So that's something that I'll definitely be looking at. But, obviously the obstruction question is huge. We heard that Barr said there were 10 episodes that Mueller was looking to at in terms of obstruction. So I think we're all going to be looking at that. Now, obviously, the president is saying he's been vindicated, he's been cleared. However, I think there could be information in here that could be politically damaging to the president ahead of a 2020 campaign. And also, I think Democrats in Congress on numerous committees who are already investigating his finances, his personal life, his businesses. I think they're going to look at that information, use that to fuel their investigation. So although President Trump is, saying he's been cleared, he has that Game of Thrones meme that he posted on Twitter saying game over, he's not out of the woods yet.
Let me ask you both this, and I'll start with you, Ellen, as well. While Julia made the point that, the report says there was no legal or prosecutorial suggestion brought forward on obstruction, when it comes to the idea of coordination or collusion or cooperation with the Russians, the report says the Trump campaign expected to benefit from Russia's illegal actions, but it did not take criminal steps to help. Now, is there a fine line here, and perhaps this will be the dinner table discussion across the United States, between what is a legal action or illegal action and what might be morally questionable? Do you think that is really the nuance here, Ellen?
Well, it very well could be, and certainly for the Democrats, it will be as they pore over this report and look for any things that could be damaging in the court of public opinion, things that could form a groundwork to go about impeachment proceedings in the House. The Democrats, again, control the House. So they'll be looking very closely at the kind of conduct listed here by Robert Mueller when it comes to President Trump and people on his team. Now, you mentioned the question of legality, and moral versus illegal, there was something very interesting that William Barr said in his comments when he talked about WikiLeaks. And just to remind everyone, when it came to WikiLeaks in the 2016 campaign, Robert Mueller's investigation has indicted Russian intelligence agents who he said stole Hillary Clinton's and other Democrats' emails. Those stolen emails, according to the investigation, were then passed on to WikiLeaks that then put them on the internet for all to see. If you hearken back to the 2016 campaign, people will remember that President Trump repeatedly praised WikiLeaks and the email leaks that were on that website. Now, in his comments this morning, Barr addressed this question of WikiLeaks, saying that the special counsel also investigated whether any member of the Trump campaign encouraged or otherwise played a role in these dissemination efforts. And then he went on to say, under applicable law, publication of these types of materials would not be criminal unless the publisher also participated in the underlying hacking. So essentially, since WikiLeaks did not participate in the hacking efforts of these emails, then that action was not a crime. So any Trump efforts to work with that or to encourage that would not be a crime either. That could be one of those areas that we see the Democrats sort of seize upon as they go through this report. And I did scroll down to the obstruction section of the report. It's volume 2, and you can already see some of the instances that are being listed here by Robert Mueller, such as the Trump campaign reacts to WikiLeaks' release of hacked emails, the president's conduct concerning the investigation of Michael Flynn. You might recall that James Comey, the former FBI director, said that President Trump asked him to sort of take it easy on Michael Flynn, who was the former national security advisor who had lied about links he had and contacts he had with the Russians. He also talks about the president's reaction to public confirmation of the FBI's Russia investigation, an investigation that we heard President Trump rail against time and time again. These were things that were investigated by special counsel Robert Mueller, and we heard William Barr talk about this in his comments as well, taking what many Democrats have described as a sympathetic view towards the president, saying that he was frustrated by this investigation that in the end did not find any conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Just to talk about those use of C words in those comments, he said conspiracy. He also said there was no collusion. Now, that's a pretty fluid term to hear the Attorney General use because it's not a legal term. And we've heard the president use it time and time again over the past nearly 2 years, saying there was no collusion, no collusion. And as my colleague Keith Bogue reminds me, is that we heard President Trump and his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, repeatedly say there was no collusion. And even if there was collusion, collusion is not a crime. And it isn't. That it's a very fluid word. It's not a technical legal term. So interesting that we heard William Barr use that term in his comments this morning. But certainly a lot for us to go through. We should tell people at home that we have not read, obviously, very many pages at all of the report itself. We're still working with what we know from the summary letter from William Barr. We have a team behind the scenes at CBC going through it. So it'll take us a little while to get to the main points, but we are getting a shape, at least, of what Robert Mueller was looking into when it came to obstruction of justice.
You know, and I'm trying to get through this. It is a lot of information. It is very dense, but we will certainly be getting through it. I want to go back, Ellen, and I want to bring Julia into this conversation as well. Ellen had talked about obstruction points and those 10 incidents that are referred to in this report. And I know you're waiting for it to download, and I bet you there's just so much interest in this that it could be a little bit slow. But before I get to you, Julia, let me play for our audience Barr's comments about obstruction. So here's that clip from his news conference.
The report recounts 10 episodes involving the president and discusses potential legal theories for connecting those activities to the elements of an obstruction offense. After carefully reviewing the facts and legal theories outlined in the report, and in consultation with the Office of Legal Counsel and other department lawyers, the Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense. Although the Deputy Attorney General and I disagreed with some of the special counsel's legal theories and felt that some of the episodes examined did not amount to obstruction as a matter of law, we did not rely solely on that in making our decision.
Now, I'm also looking at the latest moving on the wires, and Trump's legal team says the investigation shows, and this is a quote, "It is clear there was no criminal wrongdoing." I'm sure we're going to hear that message repeated over and over again today. We heard it from Trump earlier, no obstruction at that event he's holding at the White House for wounded warriors. Julia, let me get your take on those comments from the Attorney General, William Barr, as to how he came to that conclusion that there would be not enough evidence for any charge of obstruction.
Yeah, so I'm actually just getting the statement from the president's legal team as we speak. And actually, watching that entire press conference, I think a lot of critics of the president and William Barr would say that's, him making a very political move. He's essentially defending the president politically and all of, what he's been accused of in the media, if you will. There were some shots taken at the media saying there was, countless speculation in the news media about this. So, it's interesting to compare his statement to the statement that just came in from the president's attorneys. We heard that Rudy Giuliani this morning, one of the president's most ardent public defenders in the media, as well as his own attorney, said in a text, I believe it was to the Washington Post, "We're ready to rumble," kind of saying we're ready to fight about this. And I think, they're really honing in on this obstruction question because they realize that the obstruction question was really the last thing that Democrats really could hold on to at this point in the report, because we heard that the special counsel Robert Mueller said there was he didn't find evidence for any conspiracy or coordination with the Russians. So the obstruction question is huge. And, I thought it was interesting that William Barr said he disagreed with Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein in all of this. Rod Rosenstein has very much been targeted by President Trump and his supporters, the administration, for his handling of the probe. Just to go back, Attorney General Jeff Sessions had to recuse himself from the probe, 2 years ago, and then Rod Rosenstein really stepped in and started overseeing it. So to hear that disagreement is certainly interesting in terms of obstruction, but that's the one thing that Democrats are really hanging on to right now. It's the thing that they can only really attack the president on at this point.
And Julia, as I try to read some of this and share with our viewers as well, to your point, this is coming from the report. It says, while the investigation identified numerous links between individuals with ties to the Russian government and individuals associated with Trump's campaign, there is not sufficient evidence to support criminal charges. So that's coming from the report, and I'm sure that is what the reaction we're seeing from Trump's legal team is based on this as well. Ellen, you're trying to digest some of this information. Right now, we're working on just getting this report. There was a news conference with the Attorney General William Barr, but it was previous to the report being made public. Therefore, the questions as journalists that we could ask really weren't based on the information we might have had in being able to read in on this stuff and therefore ask much more pertinent and much more intelligent questions. I have to bring that point out. Ellen, as you look at this, there is a lot of stuff about Manafort. There is some stuff about Comey. There is, reports from Trump's team saying that he was right to fire Comey. What stands out for you in this, very raw stage right now?
Well, so Hannah, yeah, we're just going through some of the headlines that are coming across on the wires. Now, one of the things that is standing out to me is the amount of times that we're seeing from these brief headlines that you see President Trump try to instruct people to criticize the overall Russia investigation. You see this one line here. Trump repeatedly asked former White House counsel Don McGahn to intervene with the Justice Department after the firing of former FBI Director James Comey. So that's interesting. There had been reports over the past few days that the White House was particularly nervous about what Don McGahn might say to investigators. It had been reported that he sat for some 30 hours of testimony with Robert Mueller. These headlines also say that Trump brought up the Russia investigation to the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, quote, several times, but that Coats told him it was not his job to get involved in these investigations. So that shows you that this was something that was really, on the president's mind, that he was really, as much as he was publicly railing against this investigation, he was also, according to the investigation, asking these people to criticize it as well. The headlines we also have, and again, we should point out, obviously, this is a 400-page report. We haven't read it. These are sentences that are coming across the wire. But one other sentence talks about Donald Trump Jr. that I have here, saying that he had direct contact with WikiLeaks during the presidential campaign period. And that's important, going back to what William Barr said this morning, because he talked about the fact that WikiLeaks had posted these emails stolen by Russian hackers, Democratic emails, Hillary Clinton emails, that were seen as sort of damaging to the Democratic campaign. We heard President Trump on the campaign trail before the election repeatedly praise WikiLeaks for doing this. Now, that has been a question. The Trump campaign, the relationship with WikiLeaks, the relationship with Russia. In his statement, Barr said, under applicable law, publication of these types of materials would not be criminal unless the publisher also participated in the underlying hacking conspiracy. So one interpretation of that could be, because WikiLeaks didn't do the hacking, it was not involved in a crime. So therefore, working with WikiLeaks could not be criminal. That's going to be an area we'll probably see Democrats sort of seize upon, given that the investigation is saying that that Donald Trump Jr. had this contact with WikiLeaks. It also goes further than that, saying WikiLeaks sent Donald Trump Jr. a password to access the website PutinTrump.org, and that Donald Trump Jr. told campaign staff he successfully used the password. Now, that is, again, a sentence lifted from the report. It'd be interesting to see more of the context around that, but certainly the WikiLeaks aspect is going to loom large, as well as all of these efforts by President Trump to undermine the investigation by getting people to criticize it. Now, William Barr talked about that behavior as well, saying the president was frustrated that there was no collusion that was found in the investigation. Interesting use of the word collusion, saying that there were these leaks, that the media, there was relentless speculation. That's being seen as a pretty empathetic stance for the Attorney General to have on Donald Trump's behavior, behavior that Robert Mueller did not say either way whether or not it was obstruction of justice.
All right, Ellen, I just want to get back to Julia Manchester, who is a reporter with The Hill. And I know you have other things to do as well, Julia, because you've got deadlines as well. One of the things we won't see in this report is an interview transcript with Donald Trump, because he did not give an interview. And the Mueller team decided not to go the subpoena fight to try to do it. They sent him written questions, and he sent written answers. When the White House says there is no collusion, there is no obstruction of justice, our viewers on CBC Facebook are asking us this question. Does all of that then clear Trump? Is there a clear answer to that, Julia?
Well, it depends what you mean by clear. I think from a legal sense, yes, he is cleared in some way, on the outset, in terms of whether there was conspiracy or coordination with the Russians. And, obviously Attorney General Barr said he came to the conclusion that there was not enough evidence to support that he obstructed justice. However, there still could be information here, and definitely interviews from the special counsel with Trump administration officials and people working within the White House that could be damaging to the president publicly. So that's something to really, I think, look out to in this entire report. It's obviously going to take a little bit of time to really get through this. However, I think those interviews with White House officials and those working within the White House are going to play a big role.
All right, I want to thank you for your patience, Julia. I really appreciate it. That is Julia Manchester, reporter with The Hill. So I'm going to say goodbye to you, but I'm going to stick with Ellen Morrow. She's in Washington, and Ellen is with us here at CBC. You've been covering all of this in the lead up to it. There was so much anticipation. There were so many discussions coming from Congress about what they would do once they got that. Just bring me up to speed. And for our viewers who may be just joining us, what's the reaction from Congress right now, or particularly from the Judiciary Committee, from Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House?
Well, so Hannah, this is not, the end of this. In fact, it's probably just the beginning of a whole other phase surrounding the Mueller investigation. Part of that is the very last sentence of the report on page 182 of the obstruction section, volume 2 of the report. It's the final sentence. We already had read the sentence in William Barr's summary, but it's after going through all of the evidence, all of the possible incidences of obstruction of justice. Robert Mueller writes, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. So that's on the question of obstruction of justice. And that leaves the Democrats, a gray area to really pore over, particularly the obstruction section of the report, and look for conduct on the president that perhaps, is not criminal because Mueller has not made that determination. And William Barr says there's insufficient evidence to say it is. And once you have that kind of ruling, it's very hard to overturn. But things that sort of fall into a gray area where the Democrats can say, is that really how you want your president to behave? Again, we have to go through the report. We have to see what the evidence is. But there is that latitude for the Democrats as they look over it. Because remember, the standard for proving something beyond a reasonable doubt, for prosecuting something, is a heck of a lot different than saying this is perhaps not the kind of behavior we want from our commander-in-chief. So Democrats, we're probably going to hear that from them over the next several days. We know that some of the lawmakers on Capitol Hill will see an unredacted version of that report. So it's unclear whether Democrats will actually subpoena for an unredacted version for broader distribution. We'll have to wait and see on that. But certainly one of the most resounding messages we've heard from the Democrats today is really criticism of Attorney General William Barr. In fact, Chuck Schumer, in a tweet, essentially called Barr's press conference a campaign press conference for President Trump. Nancy Pelosi, the top Democrat in the House, has essentially said in a tweet as well that William Barr is acting as Attorney General for the President versus Attorney General for the United States. Now, obviously, we heard President Trump defend Attorney General Barr. Barr says that he had this press conference this morning in the interest of transparency. And when you skim through the report, it's certainly not heavily redacted for the most part. Again, it's 400 pages. I've done a quick scroll, but it doesn't look as though a huge amount or an undue amount of information has been withheld. But, this really is just perhaps the end of the beginning, because we're going to see this play out on Capitol Hill for the next few weeks. And again, we can't forget, there's the question of conspiracy or collusion. Barr and in the report, Robert Mueller did not establish that there was this conspiracy between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. There's this issue of obstruction. But also in this report is this very sophisticated Russian election interference campaign that Robert Mueller details, talking about Russian intelligence analysts hacking into, using social media to sow discord, stealing emails. We have another presidential election next year. So beyond looking at the issues surrounding President Trump and whether the Democrats are going to seize on anything, whether we could see them try to initiate some sort of impeachment proceedings on the basis of anything in this report, they also have an election next year that they need to secure. So important for that not to be lost. But certainly the political wrangling over this is going to take precedent over that.
Ellen, stick with me. I'm going through some of this, and I want to share with our viewers as well. This is, right off of the report that we do know the Mueller team wanted U.S. President Donald Trump to speak with them, to testify with the special counsel. They did get responses in writing, and the report says that Mueller's team was dissatisfied with those written responses from Trump, but they decided against issuing a subpoena for an interview. You can imagine the fight that would have gone on, Ellen, with a subpoena. They're also saying that they found Trump's answers inadequate, but they decided against that long legal battle, again, coming back to a subpoena. They also say, and this is from the report, that they had relevant factual conclusions on intent and credibility from other sources so that they could draw information from them. And the team investigated contacts between Trump's campaign and Russia and whether the president obstructed justice, and the written answers that they received from Trump, the questions about that perhaps possible allegations of interference, did not cover obstruction of justice. So while they got answers in writing from Donald Trump regarding those allegations of collusion or conspiracy or coordinated efforts with the Russians, they did not get written answers on questions about obstruction of justice. Ellen, part of the problem here, and our viewers, I think, can understand this, is getting a whole whack of information and then saying, all right, let's digest this, and then let's send out informed opinion on what is going on. That's some of the difficulty here. I think you're doing a great job in picking on certain parts of it to walk us through. I want to look at those redactions as well. And you mentioned that there are two versions, Ellen. One that is has fewer redactions going to U.S. members of Congress, and then there is one that is being released to the public. And will there be one that is completely unredacted that is sent to lawmakers? Yes, William Barr said, not completely redacted. In his comments today, he said that there would be a version sent to top-ranking members of the judiciary committees on Capitol Hill. It would still have redactions for grand jury material, from what I recall of his comments. So not completely redacted, but that is something that is standard practice to withhold that sort of information. So before this, Democrats had said they were poised to issue a subpoena for an unredacted version of the report, a subpoena that could have come in the reports up until today, could have come as early as tomorrow, trying to get their hands on an unredacted version. It remains to be seen whether or not they're satisfied with the version they receive, those lawmakers, with just the grand jury material redacted. Now, just to go back to what you said previous to that, Suhana, about President Trump's questions and the written responses. I haven't seen the part of the report that talks about this question of whether this whole idea of subpoenaing the president, and obviously that did not happen. Robert Mueller did not issue that subpoena. But it's interesting when you think about the comments William Barr made this morning, talking about how cooperative the president was, how no one was told they couldn't speak to Robert Mueller. Barr said that all of the documents Mueller requested were handed over from the White House. But he did not mention, when he was sort of listing that cooperation from the White House, that President Trump himself did not actually sit down for an interview with the special counsel, instead providing those written responses that you mentioned on the issue of Russian election interference, or the question of whether or not there was working together with the Trump campaign. He did not also include that the president didn't answer those questions on obstruction of justice. So it'll be interesting to get to that section of the report, because a major part of proving obstruction of justice is being able to prove that someone has a corrupt intent. So it's hard to imagine being able to prove that or to disprove that without actually sitting down and speaking with them. So again, just to remind everyone at home, this is a 400-page document. We haven't read any section of it in its entirety. We have teams at CBC News who are doing that. We're getting information sent to us on the wires. But going over why that decision was made not to subpoena the president is going to be another incredibly fascinating part of this report, Suhana. And thanks for that. You did talk about those redactions, and we've got some of that news conference from William Barr as to what he said. He also talked about executive privilege, which U.S. President Donald Trump could have utilized to add further reductions. So here is U.S. Attorney General William Barr making comments about those redactions, the elements of this report that are blocked out. And he said every single redaction was done by the book, and the White House did not interfere.
As you will see, most of the redactions were compelled by the need to prevent harm to ongoing matters and to comply with court orders prohibiting the public disclosure of information bearing on ongoing investigations and criminal cases, such as the IRA case and the Roger Stone case. These redactions were applied by Department of Justice attorneys working closely together with attorneys from the special counsel's office, as well as the intelligence community, and prosecutors are handling the ongoing cases. The redactions are their work product. No redactions done by anybody outside this group. There were no redactions done by anybody outside this group. No one outside this group proposed any redactions. And no one outside the department has seen the unredacted report, with the exception of certain sections that were made available to IC, the intelligence community, for their advice on protecting intelligence sources and methods. Consistent with longstanding executive branch practice, the decision whether to assert executive privilege over any portion of the report rested with the President of the United States. Because the White House had voluntarily cooperated with the special counsel, significant portions of the report contained material over which the President could have asserted privilege, and he would have been well within his rights to do so. Following my March 29th letter, the Office of the White House Counsel requested the opportunity to review the redacted version of the report in order to advise the President on the potential invocation of privilege, which is consistent with longstanding practice. Following that review, the President confirmed that in the interest of transparency and full disclosure to the American people, he would not assert privilege over the special counsel's report. Accordingly, the public report I am releasing today contains redactions only for the 4 categories that I previously outlined, and no material has been redacted based on executive privilege. In addition, earlier this week, the President's personal counsel requested and was given the opportunity to read a final version of the redacted report before it was publicly released. That request was consistent with the practice followed under the Ethics in Government Act, which permitted individuals named in a report prepared by an independent counsel the opportunity to read the report before publication. The President's personal lawyers were not permitted to make and did not request any redactions.
So hearing there from the Attorney General William Barr just in a couple of hours ago. We'll stick with this. This is our top story, the release, the public release of that Mueller report, although it is redacted. We've got Anthony Gagan standing by for more analysis on the release of this report. He's a law professor at Drake University, and we've reached him in Des Moines, Iowa. Professor, the White House is sending out messages and tweeting that this is a total victory for U.S. President Donald Trump. What do you make of it?
Sue, I think the White House is correct. This really is the best case scenario for the Trump administration. There apparently, I've been reading through the report over the last few minutes, and although there are additional details in the report, there really are no bombshells beyond what we already knew. And it certainly appears that what Robert Mueller found was that the Russians were primarily motivated by the desire to defeat Hillary Clinton in 2016, rather than by the desire to get Donald Trump elected. And one reason we know that is because the social media campaign that the Russians launched, it began in 2014, long before anyone knew who the Republican nominee would be. And the Russian effort to hack into the Democrats' emails began in 2015.
I've lost
which also was long.
Oh, goodness, we're having some audio gremlins, so I just want you to be patient with me. Let me check the audio again. Can you hear me, Professor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at Suhanna in Toronto?
Yes, Sue, I sure can.
Excellent. Okay, then we can continue because I just want to make sure our viewers don't miss out on your answers. Let's go to the report itself. In finding no evidence of anything close to criminal contact between the campaign, the Trump campaign, and those Russian hackers that you mentioned. Is that, again, exoneration?
It really is, because many people suspected that there was some kind of illegal coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. And it turns out there's no evidence that would reach the level of criminal conduct. And so this is a major turning point for the Trump White House, because it does free them up to put the Russia scandal behind them. And the U.S. economy is very strong right now. So I would say as of today, April 18, 2019, Donald Trump looks like the favorite to win re-election next year. And certainly impeachment is off the table. That even though the Democrats control the House, I don't see any way that they could move forward with an impeachment proceeding under the circumstances.
Let me ask you this, though. While the Mueller report does not find any or make any prosecutorial suggestion for obstruction of justice charges against the president, it does go into detail analyzing 10 incidents in which they believe there was further examination that needed to occur. So while the president's office may not have crossed the line legally, will the discussions in your country be about whether the office crossed them morally, and therefore does it honor the office of the president?
Oh, Sue, I certainly think it's the case that President Trump has repeatedly made improper statements. Clearly, the special counsel was deeply suspicious of the president's conduct in the weeks and months after he took office. Let's not forget, he fired the FBI director, James Comey, in part because President Trump did not like the fact that Comey was investigating the president's ties to Russia. And I think historians will really be struck by how the president acted in a very suspicious way through 2017. And in many ways, he brought this on himself. In part, I think it's because the president's very thin-skinned. The president came into office knowing that he certainly faced an opposition party, the Democratic Party, that viewed him more negatively than any Republican president in history. He knew he came into office with a deeply divided country, one that remains extremely divided today. And he came into office knowing that he had a track record that was extremely provocative. He'd engaged in racist statements. He himself had polarized the country. So he knew he didn't have much margin for error politically. And to have this Russia investigation underway clearly dominated his thinking through the first half of 2017. But the irony is, and I think what historians will be amazed by, is that it turns out there was no underlying criminal evidence against the president. Really, the risk to him was the possibility that he'd engage in obstruction of justice, which Mueller obviously concluded was not the case.
I want to get to another portion of this report, and while it may not all seem, nicely segued right now, we're kind of going from one piece of information that we can digest to another, so bear with me, Anthony, and I appreciate your patience. The report does say there is substantial evidence, this is a quote, that Donald Trump fired FBI Director James Comey, and we talked about that, due to his Comey's unwillingness to publicly state that the president was not personally under investigation. Now, Trump's legal team has, since this report has been released, come out and said that Trump acted clearly and properly in firing the former FBI Director James Comey. Those little nuggets, do they change the big picture at all?
No, they don't, because they simply confirm what we already knew, which was that the only logical explanation for why the president fired James Comey was to stymie the Russia investigation. But Mueller concluded that because there was no underlying crime of illegal nation, there simply was not enough to bring criminal charges against the president. And I would also remind your viewers that under the U.S. Constitution, it's not clear whether prosecutors can even indict a president to begin with. The Constitution only refers to the House of Representatives as the venue for bringing a criminal indictment in the form of an impeachment proceeding. And then finally, Department of Justice regulations do not allow the special counsel to directly indict the president. And so Mueller was quite limited in what he could do, even if he concluded that obstruction of justice had occurred. But the big point for Trump is simply the fact that there was no evidence that he had conspired, or aides in his campaign had conspired with Russia to facilitate the Russian intervention in the election. And I would add, Sue, so why did Trump do what he did? Why was he so acting in such an incriminating way? I suspect, this is speculation on my part, that the president was very worried about his longstanding financial relations with Russia that went far beyond the power deal that Mueller writes about in his report that involved Russian investments in Trump's real estate holdings. And I can imagine that the president was worried that if Mueller started to uncover rocks in the president's financial background, there could be problems for the president. But it appears that Mueller saw that as something outside his jurisdiction. And that's why I would emphasize there are two ongoing state investigations in New York, by the Attorney General and one by the Manhattan District Attorney, into the president's financial relationships with Russia. And it now appears that those are quite separate from the Mueller investigation. So when it comes to legal trouble, the president is not necessarily out of the woods yet.
We'll be watching to see what comes out of those separate investigations. Let me ask you about how your president's tune has changed, though, because just today at the White House, he's hosting an event for wounded warriors who are on a bike trek, and the president saying he's thrilled, obviously, to do that, but saying there was no collusion. He's exonerated. Earlier in a tweet after Anthony William Barr's news conference, Donald Trump tweeted, "Game over." So he believes he's in the clear, and so obviously does his legal team. But in this Mueller report, it says that Trump told then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, quote, "This is the end of my presidency," when Sessions told him that a special counsel was being appointed to investigate those links between his campaign and Russia. How far that has changed, hasn't it?
That's right. And I think that also speaks to the issue of whether or not Mueller would investigate the president's financial dealings going back many, many years. And it appears that Mueller did not see that as within his mandate if it didn't directly relate to the 2016 campaign. Now, President Trump had no idea in 2017 when he was speaking, or 2018, with the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, as far as how far Mueller would go. And it is interesting, in 2017, the president did give an interview in which he said that he believed his personal finances were a red line that the special counsel should not cross. And so, although today is a great day for Donald Trump's presidency, because it really does put the 2016 election behind him, I think it remains to be seen what the Manhattan District Attorney and what the Attorney General in New York are going to turn up. We did learn just in the last few weeks from Michael Cohen's testimony that President Trump allegedly inflated his assets when he attempted to buy the Buffalo Bills in 2014. And that, if that allegation is true, it potentially could give rise to bank and loan fraud charges. And 2014 is only 5 years ago, so that would still be within this statute of limitations. Now, I emphasize we don't know that Cohen's allegation is true, but it certainly would be a cause of concern for the president.
I want to thank you for your time, Anthony, and for your patience as we try to parse through these bits and bobs coming out on this report. You have a great day.
Thank you. You too, Sue.
Anthony Gagan is a law professor at Drake University. We reached him in Des Moines, Iowa. The Mueller report and its redacted release, 400 plus pages being released not only to Congress but to the public. That's our top story. So we're getting analysis. We're getting to the nitty gritty of what is in this report. And while it might not all sound perfectly smooth, it's about this is coming out now or in a commercial break or whatever. There haven't been a commercial break, but it means, I've had a chance to read something and we can talk about it as well. You can watch us on Facebook as well, and that's where I want to start with this next interview, as a matter of fact, because we're about to get more legal insight into that redacted Mueller report. Our Chase team has reached Jennifer Daskal. She is an associate professor of law at American University. She is in Washington. I should tell you, she also worked as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. So, Jennifer, very glad to have you on the program. I want to begin with something our Canadian audience has been asking, because we've been airing this on multiple venues. Does this clear U.S. President Donald Trump? Is there a clear answer, Jennifer?
So what it does is it says, it makes pretty clear that there's not going to be a federal prosecution for conspiracy between the Trump campaign or Mr. Trump and the Russians. But it does not, as your previous guest just suggested, it does not clear him completely. So there's still charges in which he is an unindicted co-conspirator for potential other financial violations, and the report itself doesn't clear him in the sense that, one, it establishes or it lays out a number of questionable contacts between the Russian organization and the Trump administration. It details, this part of the report is heavily redacted, but there's enough in there that shows the degree to which the Trump campaign was cheering and celebrating and helping to disseminate some of the WikiLeaks material, and that's the material that was stolen from the Democratic National Committee and the DCCC, the Congressional Committee, and then disseminated via WikiLeaks. And then there's a lot in here about obstruction of justice that I think raises some serious concerns. Again, I'm still looking through the report. It's a long report, but he may be cleared of particular criminal charges, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he's cleared generally.
One of the things we used to hear before this report came out, and it certainly took almost 2 years to get these 400+ pages out to the public, to the point right now where we can disseminate, digest, and at least inform our viewers as to what is in them. But during that time, we heard the I word a lot, impeachment. Do you think post release of this report, Jennifer, that word is still kicking around?
So it's been kicking around for a long time, and I'm sure it will continue to kick around. The question of impeachment, there's two issues. One, is there enough information, enough evidence to support impeachment? And second, is it the right thing to do? And those are two separate questions. Certainly, appears to be a lot in the report that if there was a political determination that it was an appropriate means forward, could potentially support an impeachment charge. But there's a whole set of other policy and political questions that come into play when you think about impeachment as well.
What's the first section you wanted to turn to when this actually came online? And I know it's taking some time to download different sections, but what piques your interest the most?
So I think the question of coordination and conspiracy with the Russians. Now, as Attorney General Barr said this morning, and is pretty clear from this report, Mueller did not find enough evidence to support a criminal prosecution for conspiracy. But there is a long and detailed section, of which I have not fully gone through yet, detailing all of the contacts between the Russians and the Trump campaign. And in particularly, I think something that is of particular note is the degree to which, at a minimum, the Trump campaign celebrated and helped disseminate this damaging information about both Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party more generally that had been illegally stolen from the DNC and from the DCCC.
But what this report does say, though, Jennifer, is that while there may have been that celebration of the hacking, the Trump members of the campaign did not partake or help in that hacking. Therefore, they did not cross a legal line. And I've asked this question before. Just because something doesn't cross a legal line, does it cross a moral line, an ethical line? Does it cross the line of affecting the honor, if you will, that you as Americans put in the Oval Office?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to be asking here. So yes, it does not. It's not evidence of an illegal act, but it's certainly troubling that the campaign of Donald Trump, now our president, was actively celebrating the dissemination of information that had been stolen, even if the Trump campaign was not involved in or assisted in or supported directly the stealing of that information. The campaign is benefiting from information that has been illegally obtained by Russians that are trying to undermine the U.S. elections, and you have the campaign reportedly, according to this report, seeming to be celebrating, possibly even coordinating some of the timing of the release. Again, that's not an illegal activity, but it's certainly quite questionable.
What more are you expecting from Donald Trump? Because I'm sure you saw the tweet on the whole Game of Thrones kind of meme, game over, there will be no charges, et cetera, that he's talked about in that event he's hosting at the White House for Wounded Warriors. We've heard from his legal team saying that Trump is in the clear all the way. We've heard from your Attorney General, William Barr, saying there will not be any charges of obstruction that his department will lay against the president. So really, is this over?
So, I mean, this piece of it, yeah. I mean, the president's exactly right that he is not going to be criminally charged for obstruction. He's not going to be criminally charged for conspiracy with the Russians. Members of his team are not either. But that doesn't mean it's over. You know, there is going to be another election in less than 2 years, and so it's critically important that the American public knows exactly what happened, and you know, there's other issues beyond the question of criminal prosecution. The fact that there's not a criminal prosecution does not, as you yourself said, does not exonerate the president from engaging in quite questionable behavior that crosses norms that really have never been crossed before.
I'm going to leave it there, Jennifer. I want to thank you for your time. That is
Thank you.
Jennifer Daskal with American University. Our Chase team reached her in Washington. And this is our top story, the release of the redacted Mueller report. It is being gone through by our news team, by members of Congress, by perhaps you at home, if you can see that online. We will keep you informed of not only the content, but the reaction here on CBC News Network. The just-released Mueller report reveals Donald Trump tried to take control of the Russian investigation to stop the probe into possible obstruction of justice. We have special coverage for you all day on the release of this long-anticipated Mueller report. Hello to you. I'm Suhana Marchand. This is CBC News Network. Also ahead.
I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction.
A very happy Donald Trump response to the release of that redacted report. Trump says such an investigation should never happen to another U.S. president.
Investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government.
Earlier, the U.S. Attorney General defended Trump before the release of the Mueller report. But he says the investigation did look closely at several episodes of possible obstruction of justice. It's a Mueller day, and we've got extensive coverage of this much-anticipated report for you, both this hour and throughout the day here on CBC News Network. I want to begin with some of the Mueller team's key findings on the fundamental issues, whether Trump and his campaign team conspired with Russia, and part two, whether the president tried to obstruct the investigation of any such acts. On Russia's involvement in the 2016 U.S. election, the report finds this. The Trump campaign was, quote, receptive to some offers of help by Russians. That is on page 179 as you go through that report yourself. Now, the Trump campaign expected to benefit from Russia's illegal actions. We are also learning that Donald Jr. had direct contact with WikiLeaks during the presidential campaign. On the question of obstruction, and this is a big one, perhaps that's the area you'll go to first, but the report cites this: evidence Trump both acted and intended to prevent Mueller's team from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. It says Trump did try to seize control of the Russia probe. He sought to have Mueller removed. It determines the president likely fired James Comey because the then FBI director refused to clear the president's name. Now, Trump and his supporters, they are claiming victory today, saying the report exonerates him of any wrongdoing. The U.S. president responded to the report while he was hosting an event, as a matter of fact, for Wounded Warriors. That's an organization that helps veterans, and it was taking place at the White House.
No collusion, no obstruction. There never was, by the way, and there never will be. And we do have to get to the bottom of these things, I will say. And this should never happen. I say this in front of my friends, Wounded Warriors, and I just call them warriors because we just shook hands and they look great. They look so good and so beautiful. But I say it in front of my friends, this should never happen to another president again. This hoax, this should never happen to another president again. Thank you.
So, U.S. President there at the White House, as I say, making some comments before that event with wounded warriors. Lots of numbers when it comes to the Mueller investigation. Let me just take you through some of them, and hopefully, they'll mean something. This investigation lasted 23 months, so that tells you the intensity of the work that went on with that special counsel and his team. There were 500 witnesses. There were 37 indictments, so those came out of that investigation. 199 criminal charges, and then you'll recall there were 5 guilty pleas. So those are the numbers of the report. There's also a lot of emotion invested in this report because they're talking about the highest office in the land. We've got CBC's in the United States. We've got CBC's Ellen Morrow. She is standing by live at our bureau in Washington. You've had a chance to read through some of this, Ellen. It is a monster of a document, and I know it will take time to digest, but is there anything sticking out at this point for you?
Well, so Hannah, I just want to go back to what we were discussing last hour. If people were watching then and are watching now, we talked about this question of whether or not to subpoena the president, because on this question of obstruction of justice, one of the sort of key points of proving obstruction of justice is judging whether or not someone has a corrupt intent. Now, we know Special Counsel Robert Mueller did not actually interview the president. Instead, he got written answers to questions on the issue of Russian election interference. The president did not in any form answer questions on this issue of obstruction of justice. Now, from the report, Robert Mueller talks about how they considered subpoenaing the president, how they thought it was in their authority to go ahead and do so. But this is a line from the report. It says, "We made the decision in view of the substantial delay that such an investigative step would likely produce at a late stage in our investigation to not take that step. We had sufficient evidence to understand relevant events and to make certain assessments without the president's testimony." Despite that, though, as we know, Robert Mueller did not make a final determination himself on whether or not the president committed obstruction of justice. Instead, in the report, he wrote, "If we had confidence that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and the applicable legal standards, we are unable to reach that judgment." So again, as we've gone over at the end of the report, Special Counsel Robert Mueller writes, while we did not conclude the president committed a crime, we also have not exonerated him on this question of obstruction. That could perhaps leave an area for Democrats here to look at, a gray area, as they go over the conduct of the president listed, particularly in the obstruction section of the report. Again, because whether or not something is a crime, that's a very high bar. Politically damaging actions is certainly a lower bar. So Democrats will be looking for examples of that. In terms of more specifics of what we are seeing in the report, one of them is sort of these repeated angry actions the president had towards the Russia investigation, according to this investigation, asking certain high-ranking officials to publicly criticize the investigation. This part of the report saying that President Trump asked former White House counsel Don McGahn to fire Robert Mueller. There had been some reporting, I believe, in the New York Times of that story several months ago. At the time, Don McGahn did not rebut that story, so we did have a sense that President Trump had made this attempt to have Robert Mueller fired. Now, going to other aspects of the report, we also have information about the president's reaction to the appointment of a special counsel back in May 2017, after he made the decision to fire former FBI Director James Comey. He was informed that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had appointed a special counsel, and the president, according to interviews that happened as part of the investigation, the president said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency." So from the very beginning, President Trump did not like the fact that there was this ongoing investigation, and the report details several actions in which he very forthrightly expressed his anger towards the fact this investigation was ongoing.
And while he may have said, "This is the end of my presidency," to paraphrase a couple of years ago, this morning he is claiming vindication that, the road forward is no legal no obstruction of justice charges and certainly no collusion that was found in that report as it's being released to Congress. And people, of course, they're on the Hill, are looking through that. And are they looking for anything that could lead to impeachment, or is that discussion over as well? Because, Ellen, I do know that Robert Mueller has been asked to testify. The chair of the Judiciary Committee sent out a letter suggesting that, they'd like to have Mueller come in and testify before the third week of May or something. So there is more information that lawmakers want. But is the word impeachment being bandied about today?
Well, I think Democrats are certainly going to be, looking over this report, looking for examples of conduct they can bring to the people and say, is this how you would want your leader to act? Whether or not they actually pursue impeachment is a whole other question. And you have to kind of consider the fact that we are in a very divided political environment. And really, the big question of this report is going to be, does it move the needle on President Trump? President Trump has a very loyal base. It's a very divided country. So if this doesn't change any of his supporters' opinions on him, Democrats might think that this is not a fight worth having. But certainly this provides them more specific incidences to use in their criticism of President Trump. And, we've also heard a lot of criticism for Attorney General William Barr this morning from the Democrats. They're not happy with the fact that he held that press conference before they actually had a chance to look at the report. Nancy Pelosi referred to William Barr as the Attorney General of the President versus the Attorney General of the United States. But that's right. We do have those requests from the Democrats to hear from Special Counsel Robert Mueller himself, particularly on this issue of obstruction, because again, and William Barr said this in his press conference, it's the traditional role of the investigator, of the prosecutor, of the special counsel to make a call on whether or not a crime occurred. And Robert Mueller just simply didn't do that, saying we can't really make this call either way. William Barr said there's insufficient evidence, but because Mueller did not make that call, there are so many questions for him. Why didn't he go ahead and do that? So Democrats will want to hear from him on that front. Now, interestingly, in the report, he did talk about this issue of Congress, and he said, we concluded that Congress has the authority to prohibit a president's corrupt use of his authority in order to protect the integrity of the administration of justice. So in more layman's terms, that essentially is saying that Congress has the authority to sort of handle a claim of obstruction of justice. So that kind of does potentially put this in Congress's court to determine whether they think the president committed obstruction of justice. Now, along with that request to Robert Mueller, Attorney General Barr has said he has no objections to Mueller testifying, and he himself has offered to testify at the beginning of May. So this is nowhere near over, Suhanna. This fight is going to continue.
We'll be talking again, Ellen, so hang on for me. We'll ask you to read through some more sections, and we'll talk about them on the air again. That's CBC's Ellen Morrow. She's got a tough day there in Washington and doing a great job of bringing us that information from that released but redacted Mueller report. Our Chase team has also reached Jeff Mason. He is the White House correspondent for Reuters. He's in Washington. Jeff, it's Suhanna in Toronto, and I'm so glad that we have a chance to talk about this. I do want to ask you about the fine line there. Let's start with the report saying that it could not conclude Donald Trump committed a crime, but it also could not exonerate him. Is that really the crux of all of this?
I think so. I mean, I think that's certainly what people on the Democratic side and those who were not satisfied with that 4-page letter that Attorney General Barr released a few weeks ago will be focusing on. And in fact, he quoted that, at least part of that, in that original letter. And people have been looking forward to seeing the actual details in this report. And today we have the report. We have several instances that outline areas that the special prosecutor looked at with regard to obstruction. But he didn't determine that there was obstruction, but as you said, also did not exonerate the president. So that certainly disputes what the president and his allies have been saying since Attorney General Barr's letter came out, that there was, complete exoneration. That is simply not the case in this report.
When you got the copies of this and you started going through the information, let me ask you as a reporter, Jeff, where's the first section you turned to?
Well, actually, my answer to that is I was inside the East Room of the White House, and I'm in the White House now. This is our little Reuters booth. When that report came out, listening to the president speak and attend a Wounded Warriors event. So I haven't had a chance myself to look through the report, but I know that. And it was sort of unusual timing because all of us, I think all the reporters in the room wanted to be looking through that report at that time. But there's a lot to look through, and I commend your reporter who was just talking about it. It's a lot to analyze.
You know what? It's 448 pages. It's pretty dense. There are lots of names that perhaps people might need a refresher on mentioned in those investigations. We do know of the numbers of hours of interviews, the indictments, the charges, those who are in jail, those who are perhaps facing at least trials coming up. So it is a lot of information. But what is it that piques your interest most when you do get a chance to go through that? Like, what's the burning question?
Well, a couple things. I think number one, the fact that this report confirms that President Trump asked his counsel to direct the attorney. I think it was to direct the attorney general to fire Robert Mueller.
Yes,
that's certainly going to raise questions from Democrats about how did you not take that as clear enough evidence of obstruction of justice. So I think that confirmation is certainly an interesting piece. Also, the reaction by the president when then Attorney General Sessions told him that a special prosecutor had been appointed is quite interesting. I also think it's interesting just to see how the White House continues to react. I mean, the president at that event that I referenced said, again, no collusion, no obstruction. Certainly his supporters have rallied around him and around those conclusions. Will anyone in his political base? Probably not, but certainly others just have some questions about what this means and what some of these conclusions mean for him politically. I suspect the answer to that is no. It will give a lot of fodder to Democrats. But Republicans will largely rally around this president as they have been doing.
So in other words, the polarization in your country post release of this redacted report continues.
I think so, yes. I mean, I think that one thing we can certainly say is that the debate over this is not over. Not now having all of the information is just creating more fodder and more material for people to look at. And I'm sure that there will be more activity on Capitol Hill as a result. The president will no doubt continue to say what he did this morning, that there was no collusion and that there was no obstruction, and see that as vindication, and perhaps, as he's certainly shown already, try to focus instead on the investigators and the origins of this investigation, which he considers harassment. But overall, to your question, yes, those two aspects show that the polarization will continue.
We'll certainly be watching up here in Canada. There are lots of Canadians who will be going through this report as well, and I suppose making their own judgments on how your White House performed and how the special counsel performed. I want to thank you, Jeff, for your time.
My pleasure.
Reuters White House correspondent there, Jeff Mason. He is in Washington. You're watching CBC News Network. We're keeping you informed of all of the angles and the tidbits coming out of this redacted but released report by Robert Mueller. So the Attorney General of the United States, William Barr, held a news conference earlier before that report was actually released. And then Congress got a copy of it, 448 pages, some of it redacted. It's also now out in the public space, so you could have a look at that. We know you're watching on various venues here on CBC, and we're trying to answer some of the questions you have. The biggest one being, does this now clear Donald Trump? We'll continue to get answers for you, continue to bring you bits of that report. It's a lot to digest, but we can do it. And while I've got you, I know we're looking at the White House, but I know you're also interested in the Notre Dame Cathedral, and this is one report coming out from AP that says investigators in Paris think an electrical short circuit most likely caused that horrific Notre Dame Cathedral fire. You won't miss a thing here on CBC News Network. I'm Suhana Marchand. We are back in just a moment.
So that's the bottom line. After nearly 2 years of investigation, thousands of subpoenas, hundreds of warrants, and witness interviews, the special counsel confirmed that the Russian government sponsored efforts to illegally interfere with the 2016 presidential election, but did not find that the Trump campaign or other Americans colluded in those efforts.
The U.S. Attorney General there releasing the report millions of Americans were waiting to see. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller says he was unable to conclude that, quote, no criminal conduct occurred. So he was unable to conclude that. Mueller was looking into Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election and possible collusion by the Donald Trump campaign. There are so many different angles of this story to talk about, not only, the legal angle, but perhaps the moral or ethical angle, the honor of the office of the President of the United States, the other members of the campaign that was behind Donald Trump who really were not charged or faced any other criminal events. So again, lots to talk about and lots to digest because it is 448 pages and I'm getting through it myself. I'm sure you will be doing that at home as well. But Dave Leventhal is the federal politics editor and senior reporter at Center for Public Integrity, and he joins us from Washington. Dave, I guess you're going through this as well, trying to digest those different segments, go through what has been redacted and try to read around it. What do you make of it so far?
And think of how long it takes to read a 400-page book and digest that. So everyone's trying to do this right now the best that they can. But certainly, the report has some incredibly compelling portions to it. You have different aspects talking, for example, about Don Jr., the president's son, and his communications back and forth toward the end of the campaign with WikiLeaks, which has been in the news lately because of Julian Assange's arrest. You have other aspects of it where Donald Trump has gone and had ordered, according to the report, some of his underlings to go and try to obtain the secret deleted Hillary Clinton emails that were very much at the center of the campaign back in 2016. So all these little tidbits, which, of course, as you mentioned earlier, have not led the Department of Justice here in the United States to conclude that Donald Trump has done anything illegal, but still opens that question up. And we're trying to figure out how much more of some very salacious things are actually truly in this report now that we have the full thing.
Dave, have you got to the part about the Trump Tower meeting?
Sure, and that's another element to this too. Yeah. There have definitely been contacts between the elements of the Trump campaign or the Trump transition with people in Russia. Again, the conclusion is that this wasn't tantamount to any type of illegal collusion or something that would have risen to Donald Trump himself personally facing an indictment. I mean, look, in any situation, absent Donald Trump, the notion that the Russian government or elements of the Russian government, organizations tied to the Russian government would have influenced a U.S. political election, a presidential election, I mean, that in and of itself is monumental. But the notion that the president's campaign in and of itself would have somehow been having some sort of relationship with Russian elements has really been at the heart of this whole affair over the past almost 2 years.
Dave, we know how the Democrats are reacting. They're calling for Mueller to come to testify. They're calling for Barr to do the same, and he has said he will make further comments as well before the House. They're upset at the way this came out today. I certainly haven't seen a lot of people calling for impeachment, but perhaps that's still to come as they digest this information as well. But let me leave the politicians aside, Dave. I know that there are, 360 million Americans looking at this report right now, right? What is the big question they will be discussing over the dinner tonight?
Well, certainly here in Washington, everyone's paying attention to it. I don't know necessarily how, in the state of Nebraska or right. New Mexico, how much people are paying attention. But at the same time, too, people are going to be highly focused on this. Certainly the Democrats here in Congress, here in Washington, D.C., they're trying to figure out right now that even if the report, even if the Department of Justice hasn't concluded that the president did something illegal, is there still a game to be played here? Is there still, some action? This is not over by a long shot, at least for Democrats. The president has said effectively today that he is exonerated. He put out a tweet earlier that basically said, game over. Okay, so we know where the president stands on this. But the Democrats right now, their equation, their calculus is this. Is there going to be something in this report that leads them to, number one, conduct further investigations above and beyond what they've already done with their ability to conduct oversight over the Trump administration, a power that the U.S. Congress has? And number two, and you brought it up, is the issue of impeachment. Is there anything within this report that would conclude for Democrats that they need to go forward with some sort of impeachment proceeding to basically decide whether the president has committed quote, high crimes or misdemeanors that would be tantamount to an impeachable offense, which is a different issue, a separate and apart issue from the Department of Justice determining whether the president engaged in any type of illegality.
But at some point, are you not shooting yourself in the foot? Because, you know, by harping on, continuing to, even if the House decides to call for further investigation, you have to consider the appetite of the voting public. And with your 2020 elections, you know, could happen in a blink of an eye and all of a sudden we're there. Is that the right call politically, strategically for the Democrats?
And this has been a big intramural fight within the Democratic Party as to how to proceed. You have some elements of the Democratic Party, for example, a billionaire, his name is Tom Steyer, who literally has launched a campaign and funded it with millions of dollars to try to get the Democrats to impeach President Trump. On the other hand, you have Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and many of her fellow Democrats who believe that it's not the right move for Democrats to try to go forward with an impeachment proceeding that will very unlikely result in the president being removed from office, because ultimately it will be the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate that would conduct a trial and determine whether the president would be removed from office. So it could be, you know, a kind of a Pyrrhic victory for Democrats and nothing more. So what Nancy Pelosi has largely gone forward with was the notion that, hey, look, the 2020 election, the presidential election, is going to be the ultimate arbiter of whether the public wants Donald Trump back in office or not. And there are no fewer than about 20 different Democratic candidates right now who are actively vying for the Democratic nomination, which will come at some point next year. And that's kind of where we stand at this moment.
You know what? I was actually reading on the wires earlier, Dave, that those candidates are also calling for an unredacted version to be released. Now, we know that by law in your country, you cannot release information relating to the grand jury information. So that would have to stay redacted for those legal reasons. But they want to see everything else. You know, Dave, you're the federal politics editor and I want to get this right, senior reporter at Center for Public Integrity. So let me ask you this. If the I word impeachment is not going to be the hot topic at the dinner table or in your Congress, is the I word integrity going to be the hot topic?
That's going to be something that's going to be talked about for many days and weeks going forward. The issue of whether the president or his campaign did something illegal is separate from whether he did engage something that was improper or was not filled with integrity, if you will. The president in the report, there's a line in there that talked about when the investigation, the Mueller investigation, was first happening. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, don't have the quote in front of me at the moment, but basically, hey, this might be the end of my presidency. And he used an obscene word to describe what he was. It begins with the letter F. So very strong language that was coming from the president to describe exactly what he thought about all of this when it started. So you can expect that a lot of people in the here and now, fast forward to the present day, are going to be wondering if the president, even if he didn't do anything illegal, was doing things along the way during his campaign, during his presidential transition, and even his presidential administration that just weren't really fit for a president of the United States, something that the president of the United States shouldn't have been engaging in. And that is a very open question and largely is probably going to fall along party lines to a very strong degree. Democrats over here, Republicans over there, as has largely been the case, too, over the past couple of years.
Great to have you on the program, Dave, and I thank you for your answers and your insight.
Hey, my pleasure. Thank you.
Dave Leventhal with the Center for Public Integrity. Our Chase team reached him in Washington.
So that's the bottom line. After nearly 2 years of investigation, thousands of subpoenas, hundreds of warrants, and witness interviews, the special counsel confirmed that the Russian government sponsored efforts to illegally interfere with the 2016 presidential election, but did not find that the Trump campaign or other Americans colluded in those efforts.
U.S. Attorney General William Barr just before making that report, the Mueller report, public. Millions of Americans trying to see that report. Perhaps you're doing that right now here in Canada. Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller says he was unable to conclude that, quote, no criminal conduct occurred. So he could not conclude that there was no criminal conduct. Mueller was looking into Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election and possible collusion by the Donald Trump campaign. So many angles to this Mueller report, and so many, pieces of evidence and testimony and suggestions even as well, political and legal. That's what's at the heart of this, the politics of it all and the legality of it all. For the political side of the story, I'm joined by Mark Osler. He's a law professor at St. Thomas University. He is a former federal prosecutor. Our Chase team has reached him in St. Paul, Minnesota. Well, sir, what do you think? Is this going to be something you take up with your students in class, and how so?
I absolutely will. I think this is a document that's going to be important for a long time to come. And one of the things in the commentary that I've noticed so far is people are jumping right to Volume 2 that deals with obstruction of justice. I think in the long term, Volume 1, that in excruciating detail tells us how a foreign government affected our election, is going to be much more important.
And perhaps more important considering that you're going to be going into another election shortly. Well, not shortly, but, in political timing, it's shortly.
Absolutely. And I just, in what I have been able to read, I've been really struck by the thorough nature of that part of the report, how it uncovers exactly what Russian agents were able to do and what the impact was.
While I understand your point that you're making about the importance of that discussion over foreign involvement in an election, and by the way, in Canada, we'll be going into a federal election in the fall, so there are lots of people as well on this side of the border paying close attention to what kind of interference can actually happen in an election. I'm going to do the typical, and I'm going to jump to part 2 of this, okay? So bear with me, Mark, as I take you to what I find a little bit more interesting. And I have a question for you about Robert Mueller. He was unable to refer a suggestion for prosecution on obstruction against your president, but he also could not exonerate him. How do you sit on the fence on something like that?
Actually, page 2 of the second volume sets it out, his decision process on that. And it's actually fairly subtle. That what he says there is, first, he had guidance from the Department of Justice that he could not charge the president. And given that, they resolved that their report was not going to make a recommendation one way or the other. And one of the things that is laid out there is that he made this decision not to make a recommendation, given that he couldn't charge, out of fairness. Because if a prosecutor had made that public charge of obstruction, that normally the trial process allows the figure who's charged to fight back, to bring contrary evidence. But without that process available, there wouldn't be that same kind of fairness. And that was one reason that they resolved at the outset not to make a recommendation to accept or decline the case for prosecution.
Now, the Attorney General, William Barr, when he was on this morning, he held a news conference before this redacted report actually was put into the hands of lawmakers. He said, that he found there was not enough evidence for any charges of obstruction against the president. So he found it simple to make that call. I'm wondering why Mueller didn't.
Well, as I said, it's because even before they wrote the report, it appears, the Mueller team knew that they couldn't make a charge, that they couldn't make that public charge. And given that they couldn't do that, they weren't going to conclude in this document that such a charge should be laid, because that would be unfair to the person who was accused. We're not saying it's the right logic, but that's what's set out, particularly on page 2 Volume 2.
We've all been talking, to get back to Volume 1, about collusion. But collusion, as I understand it, and Mark, you'll be able to tell me if I'm right on this or way off the base, collusion is not a legal crime. It's not a crime, whereas conspiracy would be a crime, right? So when we heard the Attorney General say that, there was no collusion, and we've heard the U.S. President say no collusion, no obstruction, is that just a nuance of the language, or should we pay close attention to that?
Well, I mean, the Trump group chose to use that word early on, and I'm not sure why. I mean, in other contexts, collusion can have meaning, but in this one, you're right, conspiracy is what matters. And it's interesting the way that the Mueller team analyzes it. What they concluded was that for there to be a conspiracy, there has to be an agreement between two parties. And here, what he found was that the Trump group was aware of what the Russians were doing. They were aware that it would benefit them, but they didn't agree with the Russians to participate in what was going on. And that's why it wasn't conspiracy.
So it's, I mean, let me try to bring this down to my house level. Your kid finds out that somebody's cheating on an exam, but they do nothing about it. That's okay? Although,
it's not okay.
You know what I mean? Or do you have the discussion about how actions can have further ramifications? And I don't mean to make this sound simplistic at all, but I'm trying to relate to it.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying, that we, it does seem wrong for a campaign to have known that a foreign government is helping it and not stop that or act to stop it. That's what happened here. However, the legal definition of conspiracy does include that there be that agreement to work together. And there just isn't evidence of that here. So I understand the frustration. Now, certainly there's a crime called misprision of a felony, where you know that a crime's being committed and you don't turn that person in and you somehow help to cover it up.
Right.
But that's not what's being considered here. It seems like what was being considered was conspiracy, and they just did not have that agreement. And knowledge itself that something that's going on isn't an agreement to work together with the other conspirators.
I bet your law class is going to be fascinating with this. And you'll go through it in all its minutiae, won't you?
I will. It's a good time to be a criminal law professor and someone who's thinking about these things.
I want to thank you for your time, Mark. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Mark Osler, law professor at St. Thomas University, and our Chase team reached him in St. Paul, Minnesota. Let's get some of the political strategy that's happening with this redacted report finally being released today. We've got Aaron Blake standing by in Washington. He is senior political reporter with the Washington Post. Aaron, there must be strategizing going on behind closed doors as those Democrats go through the minutia of this report. What are you watching for in terms of next steps?
Well, certainly there is going to be some talk about whether there are things in the report that should still come out that have been redacted. I think that the relatively minimal redactions on this report might take some of the steam out of that debate, which has been roiling for a long time here on Capitol Hill. I think that, it is a difficult situation for Democrats because on the one hand, we have a lot of rather embarrassing episodes in this report. We have a lot of instances in which the president was asking people to deny things that they didn't know were false, things the president said that simply were not true and were disputed by the actual evidence. So there's plenty of stuff to work with. On the other hand, the president has had something of a couple of weeks head start here when the Attorney General came out and said that this was something that did not include allegations of crimes, that there was no conspiracy here, and that Robert Mueller did not accuse the president of obstruction of justice. So now it's up to Democrats, I would say, to make this not just about those top line conclusions and really focus on the meat of this report.
Can I read something from the report? Because I've been going through this, Aaron, just as you, and kind of piecemeal trying to get to points that I was particularly interested in. This is exactly from the report. So, for our viewers, bear with me for the, the raw nature of this. But it says the conclusion that Congress may apply the obstruction laws to the president's corrupt exercise exercise of the powers of office accords with our constitutional system of checks and balances and the principle that no person is above the law. So is that Mueller laying out the case for why Congress is able to investigate and is able perhaps to take action against Trump on obstruction of justice? Is that what you take away from that?
Yeah, I think that one of the big takeaways here, maybe even my biggest takeaway so far, is that this report is much more nuanced on the question of obstruction of justice than Attorney General Barr has led us to believe. He basically suggested that the evidence was inconclusive, and that's why Robert Mueller decided not to reach a verdict on this. If you actually look at how Robert Mueller lays it out, it's clear that he decided this was a situation that because you cannot indict a sitting president, that he could not accuse the president of actual crimes. He decided that he could clear the president of crimes, but he decided not to do that. So basically, that doesn't suggest, that doesn't tell us whether Robert Mueller actually believes this evidence is compelling enough that it would be a criminal charge in any other case. We don't know the answer to that question. So that, I think, makes the evidence much more problematic. But the reason that that decision was made and that Mueller went down that road, and the reason that the Justice Department has that guideline, is because we do have this system in which the Justice Department has decided that these issues are to be decided in a political setting by Congress. And that was always where this was likely going to end up. But the fact that this was part of his rationale for not accusing the president of crimes, I think, is hugely significant and really should change how we're looking at this report today.
Aaron, I was just speaking with a law professor, Mark Osler. He's at St. Thomas University. He was a former federal prosecutor. And he said he found Volume 1, the whole collusion section of this report, to be most interesting. Perhaps not from a political perspective, because really Mueller did not leave an opening there. He said there was no collusion, there was no conspiracy, therefore no charges could be brought forward against so many Trump aides, and there were so many discussions about whether family members, et cetera, Jared Kushner, could be brought into that, but we didn't see that happen. So to make my point, which I know I'm digressing, but in that Volume 1, while there may not be political points to be earned, are there serious questions about the interference of an outside government, an outside country, into your election there in the United States as you prepare for 2020?
This is something that has gotten lost, I think, in this broader conversation in many ways. This was, I think a big part of that is because it is accepted and it is factual that the Russians did interfere. We know that happened. The question from there has been whether there was anything criminal in here. Of course, Robert Mueller decided that there was not. But even inside of this report, we see a number of other instances in which those ties between Russia and the Trump campaign are drawn a little bit closer than we knew before. There is one instance in which Robert Mueller describes meetings between Trump's campaign chairman and a Russian associate who has ties, alleged ties to Russian intelligence. He said that their exchange of information about the campaign was ongoing, which is more than we knew before. There's also an instance in which the report makes clear that the day President Trump came out and talked about how Russia should hack those 30,000 missing emails from Hillary Clinton, it was actually shortly after that, the same day, that Russia did in fact attack Hillary Clinton's email server. So some of these dots are being connected by this report. They're not being connected in a way that Mueller felt comfortable accusing the president of a crime. But certainly you're right. The fact that the Trump campaign at least appeared indifferent or encouraging of this kind of assistance, I think is something that should be dealt with on a political level, even if it's not necessarily a crime.
We'll be watching, Aaron, to see the discussions around that very issue. I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Aaron Blake, a senior political reporter with the Washington Post, and our Chase team reached him right there in Washington. As we head to a short commercial break, I just want to go through some of the many numbers behind the Mueller report. I'm not going to test you on this stuff, but I do want you to understand the scope of it. The U.S. Special Counsel's team interviewed 500 witnesses. Mueller handed down 37 indictments in total. And on top of that, there were 199 criminal charges that were laid. During his nearly 2-year investigation, Mueller got 5 guilty pleas from people within Trump's inner circle. We will keep you covered throughout the day right here on CBC News Network. Our top story is that Mueller report. A redacted version has been released, 440-odd pages, gone to Congress, out in the public venue right now, so you can take a look at it as well. CBC has posted a link to that. We've got Natasha Fatah. She's been poring over many sections of this, 2 volumes, one dealing with collusion with the election of 2016, and the other dealing with obstruction of justice. You know, there are so many bits to be pulled from each of those volumes. What stands out for you?
Well, there's one issue around the number of times, according to the Mueller report, the unredacted elements that are available, that Trump repeatedly tried to seize control of the probe, that he was concerned about the impact it would have on his presidency, on his legacy, and repeatedly tried to move people away from answering questions, away from testifying. In fact, he scrutinized 10 separate episodes where the president was talking about the firing of James Comey and was giving directions to some of his subordinates to, in fact, not cooperate with the investigation as it was moving forward, to encourage witnesses to maybe not give the kind of answers that would make the president look bad. So despite that, no criminal activity found, no charges being laid, and no clarity in terms of obstruction of justice. Repeatedly over the course of the day, we've been talking about whether something was illegal or unethical, and certainly there are points of concern that are coming out through the report that's been made available. Now, what President Trump was willing to answer, because he offered up written answers, was not willing to sit down for an interview. His lawyers said that they fell within the rules of conduct, that they were within his constitutional powers. He answered the way he needed to, but we know that Mueller and his team were deeply unsatisfied with some of the answers that came through, that the president was being evasive in some of his answers, that they were inadequate, and they actually considered issuing a subpoena against then President Trump. But they thought they would get stuck in such a lengthy legal battle, Suhana, that they actually opted against it. And considering the number of other people that they were interviewing and the amount of documentation they had, they thought they could get to the truth and the facts through other means. But it certainly was a source of concern for the investigation as they were moving forward. They were deeply dissatisfied because there were so many times that Trump said in his answers that he didn't remember certain instances. For example, he didn't remember 2016 meetings at the Trump Tower between top aides in his campaign and Russian lawyers, that he didn't remember that there was an offer from Russian power holders within the Kremlin that they would support his campaign, or that they actively wanted to work against Hillary Clinton. So they were unsatisfied with all of that. All of this moving forward, Robert Mueller described 10 instances where there could have been potential obstruction of justice, but we know that he offered no clear instance in terms of moving forward with a criminal charge, and we know that Barr didn't either. So we'll continue to go through this and bring you all the details.
All right. Thank you, Natasha.
You're welcome.
You're watching CBC News Network. Our top story is the release of the Mueller report. A redacted version of the Mueller report is finally out today for the public to go through. More than 400 pages. It is shedding light on Trump's reaction to learning the Justice Department had convened a special counsel to investigate Russian interference. It was the Attorney General at the time, Jeff Sessions, remember him, who broke the news. Well, according to notes from Sessions' Chief of Staff, Jody Hunt, Trump slumped back in his chair and said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm effed," to use that word. The report says the president became angry and lambasted the Attorney General for his decision to recuse himself from the investigation, stating, "How could you let this happen, Jeff?" So these are the bits and pieces coming out of that Mueller report, and there are many more. As we've been telling you, it is Mueller Day in Washington. Here's a look at the White House. Trump's legal team is claiming victory. The U.S. president says he's exonerated. There was no collusion, no obstruction. We will bring you all the reaction from the Democrats. My colleague Andrew Nichols will keep you informed here on CBC News Network.